Now we're going to go into Unit 3 of Macroeconomics, and you're going to start to notice that this is very similar, at least conceptually, to Unit 2 of Microeconomics, mainly supply and demand. While it's mostly the same things, it's going to be different ideas, different justifications, different concepts that we're going to understand. The most important thing to understand in this unit is the idea behind why we're doing all of this, what's going on behind all of this, and how to actually explain this on AP exam. So let's first talk about aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is just like you saw in microeconomics, is a downward sloping curve showing demand. However, the difference? In microeconomics, we're talking about a company or a firm, so a demand curve is just the demand for one specific product at a firm. So let's say that this graph was a microeconomics demand graph. This would show the demand for one specific good. So let's say mangoes from Amazon. It would show the demand for one good for all individuals. The difference with this aggregate demand is it's aggregate. Aggregate stands for adding all together. So this is the demand for all products across an entire nation. So in microeconomics, it would be the demand for one specific good at a company. Here, it's the demand for like mangoes across the entire U.S. While in microeconomics, it would be the demand for mangoes at Amazon or for Amazon. So in microeconomics, it's kind of small economic units. In macroeconomics, we're talking about the demand for all the good across an entire nation. Also, something different, on the x-axis, we have real GDP, gross domestic product, and on the y-axis, we have price level. So, what this is basically saying is that the more GDP it is, the less price it's going to be. Kind of similar to what we saw on demand in microeconomics. So now you shift this graph based on the basic ideas of demand. But what dictates demand? Well, the shifters are GDP. Remember, C, I, G, X minus M? Those are the same shifters here today. So let's say consumer spending increases. That means the demand curve will shift to the right. Consumer spending decreases, it shifts to the left. Let's say investment decreases, it shifts to the left. Government spending increases, then it shifts to the right. Basically, the way you shift the demand curve is the same things that shift GDP. So, an increase in consumer spending, we would see a shift to the right. A decrease in government spending, you shift to the left. The changes in GDP shift the aggregate demand curve. So, we're going to be talking about this later. Now, let's talk about supply. Just like in microeconomics, it's an upward sloping curve. This stands for short run aggregate supply. So, this is in the short run. We're seeing a positive relationship between real GDP and price. So the more GDP, the more money or more a country produces, the higher the price of a good. And the way we shift it is kind of similar to microeconomics. Change in resource prices. So if things like oil or gas are more expensive, that shifts short-run aggregate supply to the left. Let's say the government spends more on supply, that would shift to the right. And then changes in productivity. If workers are more productive, that shifts to the right. If they're less productive, it shifts to the left. So now we also have long-run aggregate supply. The main difference, short-run aggregate supply is a positive sloping line, kind of like this. Long-run aggregate supply is a flat line, kind of straight like this. That's because in the short run, wages and resource prices are sticky. They don't really change. We kind of saw this recently. 4 or 5 years ago in 2021, 2020, there was a really high rate of inflation, 7-8% across the United States and a lot of other nations across the entire world. The problem was that wages didn't really increase with the increase in price level. So a lot of people did really suffer. Because in the short run, wages and resource prices don't actually change. They're sticky. They stay the same, but price level does change. However, in the long run, eventually, wages and resource prices are flexible. They do change. Eventually, wages do increase no matter what. So that's where we get our actual equations. In the short run, things like price level always increases. So it's a positive line, kind of like this. In the long run, it's kind of like this. It's a straight line. You don't really need to understand the justification. Just remember that we have long-run aggregate supply is like this. It's a straight line, just like that. Now we can shift long-run aggregate supply in two main ways. Resource quantity, so the amount of resources we have, and a change in technology. Just remember these two, If there will be questions asking you, oh, does a change in resource prices change long run aggregate supply? Remember, it doesn't. In the long run, changing resource prices doesn't matter. So now we have a graph kind of like this, pretty similar to microeconomics. On the x-axis, we have real GDP. On the y-axis, we have price level. We have a short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Then in the middle, in between the equilibrium, we have long-run aggregate supply. Just remember this graph. This is a basic graph that we're going to see time and time again. Now, this graph can show inflationary and recessionary gaps. Remember, an inflationary gap is just when demand or supply is a lot higher, meaning prices are really high. That's basically what an inflationary gap is. It's inflationary. It's a higher price level than what people can afford. So this graph kind of shows that. Demand is way higher than long-run aggregate supply. It's to the right. So demand is really high, way too high. Recessionary gap, remember, that's when the economy is not really growing that well. There's not a lot of job opportunities. Economic growth is really slow. Because of that, demand is really low. So just remember, inflationary gap, AD and A short run aggregate supply are to the right, recessionary gap, it's to the left. Just remember how to graph these. And if you are having trouble or this is going too fast or you need practice, in the link in the description, there's a link to practice problems, I believe 10 to 20, where you can practice graphing all of this, where you can practice having AP style questions that go over all of this. And make sure you look at the answer key, because a lot of those explanations can actually help you better understand all of this. Understand that there's two main types of inflation like we learned in the last unit: demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. With demand pull inflation, that's caused by an increase in demand. So aggregate demand is way too much to the right. Cost push is due to not a lot of supply, so it's an increase in prices. So that's when short run aggregate supply is to the left. So just make sure you can model these and show these on a graph. Now there's this old economic theory that even if we're in an inflationary recessionary gap, these are both really bad. In the long run, it's just going to self-adjust. In the long run, demand will decrease or demand will increase in this situation, and thus everything will just go back to normal. This is a normal graph. This is the ideal economy. These are both bad. And in the long run, everything's just going to self-adjust. In fact, we've had this theory for 100, 200 years. However, in the 1930s and 40s, people started arguing, hey, maybe this is going to take way too long. That's because during the Great Depression, many people predicted in the long run it's going to self-adjust in 20, 30 years. In fact, there's this famous quote that in the long run, everyone is dead. What that means is in the long run, we're going to see that it's just going to take way too long of a time. So in the 1930s and 40s, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt and a lot of other countries around the world, we started experimenting with the government getting involved to reduce inflationary or recessionary gaps. The way we do this is with fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is basically the government's way of speeding up that long-run self-adjustment. It's basically their way of solving the economy, going back to the ideal situation in a faster amount of time. The way we do this is using contractionary and expansionary fiscal policy. First, let's talk about contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy tries to slow down the economy, and the reason we do it is to stop inflationary gaps. So remember, inflationary gap is because the economy is growing too fast. We need to slow down. So if we're in an inflationary gap, the government might use a contractionary fiscal policy to slow down the economy. So just remember, the way we resolve an inflationary gap is with contractionary fiscal policy. So then let's say we're in a recession, the economy is growing really slow, and the government wants to speed up the economy. They're going to use expansionary fiscal policy, expand the economy. So just remember, contractionary fiscal policy slows down the economy, expansionary fiscal policy speeds up the economy. So contractionary fiscal policy resolves an inflationary recession or inflationary gap, and expansionary fiscal policy reduces a recessionary gap. But how exactly does the government do that? Well, fiscal policy is basically changing how much government spending is. Remember, all of this is dictated by the formula that we learned last unit, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So the government changes the G. They influence the G. So how do they do this? For contractionary fiscal policy, to slow down the economy, they reduce government spending, or they increase taxes, both of which decrease the economy. So just remember, contractionary fiscal policy, you either increase taxes, decrease government spending, or both. Then expansionary fiscal policy, if they want to speed up the economy, they decrease taxes, increase government spending, or both. This is all really, really important. There's a lot of questions regarding this, both FRQ and multiple choice questions. You need to understand when a government would use contractionary fiscal policy, when a government will use expansionary fiscal policy, and what specifically is definitionally a contractionary fiscal policy. Does increasing taxes, is that expansionary or contractionary? Is increasing government spending, is that contractionary or expansionary? You need to understand that. Now, contractionary and expansionary fiscal policy both work by changing the national deficit. So what that means, contractionary fiscal policy, just remember, it contracts, reduces. So it decreases the deficit. Something we learned last unit, the deficit is simply the change in the national debt. So it decreases the deficit. That's because the government is spending less but earning more because it's an increase in taxes. So it decreases the deficit, which eventually will decrease the debt. Then expansionary fiscal policy, on the other hand, would increase the deficit. That's because the government is spending more to speed up the economy and earning less because it's reducing taxes. So just remember, a contractionary fiscal policy decreases the deficit, while inflationary fiscal policy increases the deficit. Now we have automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers are basically different types of fiscal policy. There's two main types. Discretionary fiscal policy. This is basically Congress creating a bill or some sort of resolution or some sort of act, some sort of policy that is designed to increase government spending or taxation. Basically, Congress has to sign something to actually change fiscal policy. Non-discretionary fiscal policy is what we call automatic stabilizers. Basically, it's permanent spending or taxation laws enacted to work or counter cyclically to stabilize the economy. So it's basically the government spending automatically or changing automatically without signing a bill. So if you're signing a bill or act, that's discretionary fiscal policy. If you're not, that's non-discretionary fiscal policy or automatic stabilizers. So an example of automatic stabilizer would be unemployment and welfare or income taxes. The government doesn't have to sign a bill for that, but they can change and influence that. Now, you might think, oh, if the government spends $10 billion on the economy is going to grow by $10 billion, right? That makes sense. In fact, that works all the time. But that's not necessarily true. That's because if the government spends $10 billion, well, the people that get the $10 billion, let's say they give $10 billion to farmers, the farmers are going to spend a lot of that money on fertilizer or equipment or stuff they need. So that ends up boosting the economy more. And then the people that receive the money from the farmers, they're going to spend as well. So it's just a cycle where people are spending money. So if the government spends $10 billion, it's actually going to produce a larger effect on the economy. This is called the multiplier effect. It's basically the government spending money and it starts to almost multiply. However, this depends on how much people consume or spend. So we have two main things: marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save. Marginal propensity to consume is basically people's tendency to spend money. The way we calculate it is change in consumption over change in disposable income. So let's say, for instance, you have $10,000 and you spend $4,000. That means your change in consumption would be $4,000 and your change in disposable income would be $10,000. 4,000 divided by 10,000, that means 0.4. What an MPC of 0.4 means is that, let's say you have $1 million, that means you're going to spend $400,000. It's basically your tendency to spend money. Marginal propensity to save is simply how much your tendency to save money. Same equation here, but it's your change in savings. So let's say you have $10,000 and you save $6,000. 6,000 divided by 10,000, that's 0.6. So make sure you understand how to calculate these. Another way to calculate marginal propensity to save or marginal propensity to consume is just remember marginal propensity to save and consume add up to 1. That's because we're either spending or saving all our money. So if marginal propensity to consume is 0.4, that means MPS is 0.6. Or let's say MPC is 0.5, that means MPS is 0.5. This basic formula can help you solve the other while only solving marginal propensity to consume. So how do we actually calculate the spending multiplier? If the government spends $10 billion, how do we calculate how much it's going to benefit the economy? There's two main formulas you can use. 1 over marginal propensity to save, or the exact same thing, 1 over 1 minus MPC, both of which are the exact same thing. This basically shows how much people are going to spend, and thus how much is going to benefit the economy. So let's say the government spends $10 billion on, let's say they give it to businesses. Then businesses have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.9. That means that businesses are going to spend 90% of that $10 million. So they spend $9 million. So the overall benefit to the economy is 10 million plus 9 million, 19 million. That's kind of the spending multiplier, and that's how we calculate it, using 1 over MPS. The tax multiplier for when we increase or decrease in taxes, that's MPC over MPS. It's a hard concept to understand that, hey, the government spends $10 billion. That doesn't mean it's going to increase by $10 billion. But once you understand it, you can probably start to calculate it. If you're having troubles with MPC and MPS, in a link in the description, there's a lot of questions regarding MPS, MPC, how to calculate it, how to actually understand what's going on with the multiplier. Now you understand at least aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Make sure you understand how to graph all of this. Make sure you can show inflationary and recessionary gaps. Most importantly, and what I've seen a lot on the AP exam, fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, they test a lot. Make sure you understand contractionary and expansionary fiscal policy, the two mechanisms. You either increase taxes, decrease government spending, or decrease taxes and increase government spending. And make sure you understand that fiscal policy tries to solve the long-run self-adjustment.